Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Charmaine Chrockett, CanWaCH's Director of Stakeholder Engagement, and I support the membership in the areas of communications, public engagement, and public opinion research. Today's webinar is an opportunity for CanWaCH to provide an update on recent activities around engaging Canadians, as well as public opinion research on Canadians' views on international aid and women and children's health amid COVID-19. I'm going to cover a few updates to kick things off today, and then I will turn the webinar over to CanWaCH's interim CEO, Julia Anderson. She will provide an update on last week's ministerial roundtable with Karina Gould. This aligns very closely with public opinion research that David Coletto from Abacus Data will present to you. We have not released this research until today, and the full report will be available on our website after this call. So I would like to begin my update by sharing a new activity undertaken by Global Affairs Canada. Earlier this month, they launched the Global Affairs Canada Executive Advisory Council on Engaging Canadians as Global Citizens, known as EXAC. This council was created to generate a space for dialogue and learning on best practices, lessons learned, and innovative partnerships on engaging Canadians. As you know, public engagement has long been a priority for global affairs, but the current pandemic has brought about a new level of importance and complexity. As Julia will share momentarily in her remarks, the Honourable Karina Gould, Minister of International Development, has reiterated on several occasions that current events are challenging all of us to speak to Canadians in a way that connects our domestic realities to global challenges. At its first meeting of EXAC, Global Affairs shared some draft content for an online platform they are developing that includes a toolkit for Canadian organizations like ours to support in engaging Canadians. So stand by for more on that, or contact your organization's Global Affairs Program Officer for more information. In relation to greater collaboration on engaging Canadians, Lead On Canada recently celebrated its 2-year milestone. Lead On Canada is the CanWaCH public engagement campaign developed for members by members to support and amplify our collective work in global health. We tell our important stories by spreading the word on social media and shining a light on Canada's pride and achievements in making the world a better place. As we mark the 2nd year anniversary, CanWaCH is gathering feedback from our members on the development of our next engagement strategy. Our Senior Public Engagement Officer, Lauren Murray, who leads the campaign, is posting a link to the survey in the chat box. So we'd really appreciate it if you could take a look and fill that out. Thank you. On a final update from me, the CanWaCH Public Engagement Working Group, comprised of our members, has been diving into how effectively measure engagement, determining the best analytics and data points needed to arrive at a meaningful and accurate reflection of how Canadians engage with the work and the stories we share has become even more challenging as much of our outreach has gone digital amid COVID-19. No public events means it's even harder to gauge our engagement with the public. CanWaCH and the Public Engagement Working Group have been collecting specific examples from members on how they measure engagement, including data points, tools, and analytics, and which of these have been successful or not. In addition to that, Global Affairs Canada is currently working on a framework for measuring public engagement and hope to have this framework ready this summer. And so to further support our public engagement communications leads in our membership, the Public Engagement Working Group will be presenting a workshop late this summer to share these best practices, data, and tools in effectively measuring engagement. Please watch your inbox and CanWaCH social media channels for updates. Now I'm going to hand over the webinar to CanWaCH's interim CEO, Julia Anderson.
Thanks so much, Charmaine, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. Very excited to be here and to be in this conversation with you and provide this update to you as our members, as our colleagues and our partners. I think, as Charmaine alluded to, there's been so many conversations going on in the past year, the past 6 months, on this notion of public engagement and engaged publics and engaged Canadians, both at the global affairs level, internally as a sector, as we've addressed and sort of thought through COVID and how to talk about our work in the context of COVID, but also previous to that, the minister really, as she entered her portfolio as Minister of International Development, really calling out to us in her the very first remarks she gave to the sector, calling out to us to say we need to do things differently. We need to engage Canadians more. I've done personally a lot of thinking about this issue because I started out my career in public engagement, and it's been a consistent element of sort of all the work that I've done and all the jobs that I've done since. And I think it's a tough nut to crack. And every time we enter conversations with one another as a sector about what it means to engage the Canadian public, there's a lot of confusion and definition setting, and are you talking about this or are you talking about that? So I wanted to start out this conversation before we invite David in to talk about the polling, to do a little bit of a level set based on all the conversations that have been happening across the sector and at different levels within government. And I really, as I was developing sort of what I was going to say, I started at the beginning. So I started with what's our goal as a sector? And I did that because if you don't start there, and if you don't sort of start from first principles, it's very easy to get lost in this conversation and to get lost in the language that we use interchangeably for things that are quite different. So I started out, what's our goal? So peace and prosperity for people, the planet, now and into the future. That comes from the SDGs. That is our collective, the collective space within which we work. That's the founders of our organizations. That's why they started them, for taking off their individual piece of the pie when it comes to building a world that looks better than the world that we have today. So healthy and thriving people, healthy and thriving planet. That is our work. That's our bread and butter. That's what we do. That's what we're activated around, both in the global south and in Canada. Another foundational principle that we all work within, or space that we work within, but we don't always talk about in ways that are useful to drive action, is that Canada has a role to play. So we spend a lot of time talking about the roles that our individual organizations have to play. So how we engage in that big goal, what we do to bring forward the future that we want to see as individual organizations. But we don't spend as much time talking about sort of Canada as a nation state. What is the role that we see as Canadians? We are taking a role in this work. We are doing the work. We are undertaking the day-to-day. But how does that all ladder up and come together in terms of the role that Canada has to play? But it does underpin what it is we do. So if Canada has a role to play, then Canadians also have a role to play. And as we sit back and think about, okay, so if we believe that's the world we want to create, we believe that Canada as a nation has a role to play in that, we believe that we are playing our individual roles as civil society organizations contributing to that big picture, how do Canadians that are not the Canadians that are us, who are working in this field and actually doing the work, but Canadians writ large, how do they fit into that picture? So that could be segments of the population that include decision makers. That could be segments of the population that are, quote unquote, Joe public. That could be specific groupings like diaspora or Indigenous Canadians that have different interests and capacities to bring to the conversations. There's lots of ways to think about that Canada, or that Canadians that are not us. But for a moment, just imagine, what would it look like if we got to a place where we could say we have an engaged Canadian public? So we've heard from many different people in spaces that the Canadian public is not engaged. And I think David's presentation, not to give too much away, but we'll talk about the ways that Canadians, based on this polling and polling that was done previously, how Canadians see themselves in this. And I think there's some good news stories and some not as, some more negative sort of news stories or taglines that will come out of that presentation. But if we're going to sit back and we're going to say, okay, back to first principles, what would it look like if in 2030 we're sitting here and we say, oh yes, we have an engaged Canadian public on issues of international development, of international solidarity, of cooperation that ladder up to that goal that we are trying to work for every day of making a better world. So one way that we would know if that is the case is if we saw Canadians volunteering. So many of your public engagement programs access Canadians outside of your workforce and your colleagues by engaging them as volunteers, having them undertake work, whether it's fundraising work, whether it's work for events in education, educating others, that kind of thing. Or going also overseas to do volunteering work through placements and co-ops and things like that. So you engage Canadians as volunteers. So we know that in 2030, if we looked at the Canadian landscape, we would see an uptake or an increase in volunteerism for your organization. So right now, my understanding is that there's a downward trend, and so we would have reversed that and we could say, yes, Canadians are engaged because they're volunteering. The second critical way, which easy to measure, easy to understand whether we're successful in this or not, that's in giving. So an engaged Canadian public, one demonstration, one manifestation of engagement is that Canadians are donating to your organizations. And it's a nice metric because it's pretty easy to measure. They are giving this much. These are the types of people that giving this. These are the times they give, and this is what they respond to. But that is a critical element of engagement. And I get a little bit prickly when people start talking about engagement is only in these next two categories or the first category, and it's not in all these things. No, all of these are manifestations of an engaged public, and we need to consider them as a full portfolio and program of what it looks like to have engaged Canadians. So the next piece is around, I had down here, we have good people at first, and then Charmaine and Lauren advised me that doesn't make any sense. But what I was trying to get at is a lot of the public engagement work I did when I entered this sector was in building citizenry, in building the fabric of democracy, of people who understand issues that are complex and messy, and they understand them at a level that they can talk about them in an informed way, that the news and the media, both social media and other media, formal media, can have smart conversations about complex global issues that our organizations tackle on a day-to-day basis. So what would that look like? And this is where we couldn't find, what I wrote was, it would look like we have good people around us. We have good Canadians, we have good citizens. How exactly we could measure this idea of an educated and informed citizen is complicated. It's not as easy as the dollars and cents of volunteer hours or giving, but nonetheless, it's a critical component that your organizations work on and talk about when you're talking about public engagement. And I would argue that when Global Affairs Canada talks about public engagement, this is often their comfort space. So they like things like the Lead on Canada campaign that Charmaine referred to, that's been going on for 2 years, that's really about pure education and informing, telling our stories. We hear that over and over, explaining the issues in a way that meet Canadians where they're at, etc. So I think most of what the bureaucratic side of Global Affairs Canada is thinking about when they're thinking about engaged and informed citizens, or when they're thinking about public engagement for Canadians, is around this education and information. And I think we're going to get better. We're hoping to take a role in getting better at defining what the metrics, what the manifestations and metrics of success would be in that space. But it's also, I think, it's important to mention because it's not the only piece of the puzzle. So we've talked about these other two pieces. The final piece, and this is where it's going to be in big, because this is about politically activated citizens. So if you have a public, or maybe I would say we do have a public right now that are volunteering. We have individuals stepping up to volunteer for organizations. We have Canadians who, because of the effectiveness of the stories that you tell as CSOs, they're giving a lot of money. They are donating still. I know it's on the decline, but we can't ignore the fact that it is a positive indication of engaged citizens. We have amazing education and information, storytelling capacities and initiatives. I've been involved in many different kind of versions of this and been just blown away by the ways in which we get creative about telling our stories and engaging Canadians. And I can list off a ton of different programs that have been funded by Global Affairs Canada, including Lead on Canada, that I think do a good job of this. So what's missing then? What's missing is that we haven't been able to translate those three first sections of engaged publics into a public that cries out when, for example, a 25% cut to development assistance is put on the table by a Canadian political party. We do not have a public that says, hey, government in this COVID moment, we need to see that you're taking a global response to this. We do not have a public that is demanding stories in the media that reflect the kinds of work that we do. So we are doing pretty well, and we need to get better at measuring and better at thinking on the first three. But I think we've taken a bit of a back seat as organizations, saying that if we do those three things, a knock-on effect will be that people will become politically activated. And in fact, that's not what we find. And I think David's really going to dig into some of the framing and the ways in which we could politically activate, but also give us the stark or solid clarity around the fact that we do not have an activated base of people who we can really get to move and champion these ideas to then drive for their political leadership. Go to the next slide, Amanda. So why does this matter? Because I think for a long time, it didn't matter as much. We didn't need necessarily an engaged Canadian public as long as we had, again, the baseline of those other three areas of our work, because we had committed and ongoing party by party. This is not a partisan. If you look at the stats, it is we have had all party support and political leadership on our file. So I can't remember exactly who said it, but a political commentator who's been watching prime minister by prime minister and sort of studying the way that they act. And the person said, as prime ministers come into their kind of maturity and become statesmen over time, that he had noted that they all kind of come to this conclusion that international development work is a necessary part of being Canada. It's a necessary part of who we are and what we need to be doing on the world stage. Recently heard a great interview with the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien talking about what motivated him to get involved in aid. And it's because, he was talking about, he came from a poor community. So then when he visited the continent of Africa, I believe he was in Kenya, and saw kind of the poverty, it resonated for him personally. And it was as he came into his portfolio and settled in as prime minister that he really started seeing the importance of that. But prime minister by prime minister, that has been consistent. We have had political leadership and commitment to our file in such a way that we haven't had to be out there demanding action, pulling on our levers, our carrots and our sticks to drive political action, because the leadership has generally, and we've given great ideas. We've fed, from Muskoka to the SRHR commitment recently to the Charlevoix education. We've been great at populating government inboxes with amazing policy ideas for how to move this file forward. But we haven't had to turn and say, and by the way, you need to do this, and you need to do this for these reasons, at least to the degree that we do now. So the political landscape as it is, we're seeing an all-time low, I would argue, from my study of our sector since it began. We're seeing less political leadership than we ever have before. I mean, we are struggling to have the government make announcements that are safe, and I think David's presentation will show that this Liberal government has the political cover they need to talk about development. Their base is generally supportive, and yet there's this kind of, for many reasons, polarization and all kinds of things, fear of talking about international work. And we can talk a lot about COVID and its impact on that, and we can talk about minority government and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the conclusion is the same. We have an all-time political low when it comes to leadership on our file. And that, of course, is not only with the current government, but also it was the first time in history that a major political party actually campaigned. And I spoke to the person Hamish, who came up with this within the Conservative war room, and he said it was the best idea ever to campaign on cutting aid. He said it satisfies all those people, all those MPs within our party who don't like aid. Canadians don't understand aid well enough to really understand that we're giving very little, and so we can give to cut it. They think that we're giving so much more than we are, so to cut it sounds like a good idea. It was a big kind of win when it came to political strategy for the Conservative Party, though they didn't end up obviously winning the election. But I think those two indicators, the fact that even with a government who is on the surface incredibly committed to the things that we're committed to, we still haven't seen a change to the IAE, to the International Assistance Envelope. And then we have now on the table, and you can't take these things off the table, we have on the table the idea that maybe it's a good idea to slash and burn the remainder of the very small aid budget. So the need at the same time, and COVID has really highlighted this for us, the need, the urgency, the gaps are at an all-time high. I mean, the kinds of economic crisis that goes along with the health crisis that are washing over the communities that we work within are unprecedented, and they will continue to play out as the secondary, the effect of COVID directly on livelihoods, but then also the secondary effects on people's ability to live in community and thrive will be devastating. So as our political leadership has gone down, the need has gone up. So as a sector, I think the reason there's been so many great conversations is because we have acknowledged this. We've acknowledged that these things are true. We get nervous. We get kind of, nervous, scared that what is this going to mean for our sector? How are we going to work? How are we going to get back to that big goal that we have to contribute in building a better world and a better future? And we get nervous, we get scared. Unfortunately, there's been a stagnation. So very little personal, very few people's, CEOs and leaders, personal Twitter accounts came out just, absolutely against when that announcement was made by the Conservative government. Very few of us have kind of sharpened our political stick to say, you know what, we did. This is our, as citizens, this is our demand on the government that they step up and do something when it comes to the developing world and COVID. That yes, it's important to focus on Canadians, but Canada lives in the world. And if Canada lives in the world, we've got to do something. How come we haven't been coming out more strongly on that? So where are we going to go? What's the next steps? This is laying out the foundation, and I think it's important because I think so many of these conversations, we can look at our work and say, but we are doing great work. We are engaging Canadians. I don't think that we've appropriately as a sector determined the question, what are we trying to solve for? What is the real challenge that's laid out in front of us that we are trying to solve for? And then what are the activities that we line up? If you're trying to do fundraising, make sure your activities engage Canadians in such a way that they give money. So if you're trying to change the political landscape and the political narratives and trying to shift public opinion, what are the tools and how can we retool as a sector to really be able to do that? And it's not easy because our work is complex, it's deep, it's global, it's big, and how do we communicate that in an effective way? And as Step C says, sweeten the carrot and sharpen the stick. So I think the first step, and we're going to work on this at CanWaCH, is identifying the portfolio of programs. So really shaping out in this public engagement landscape, what are you as organizations doing, and how does the overarching portfolio address all of those ways that we need to see engaged publics? So a healthy overall diverse portfolio will see fundraising go up. This is not about saying, abandon all your fundraisers, move over and become, advocacy specialists. No, those other ways of seeing engaged publics are critical, and they all work together in order to reinforce. But 1, 2, and 3, A, B, and C don't necessarily lead to D. And I think that's the one important thing to take away from this. So what is our overall portfolio, our diverse portfolio that achieves all those manifestations that we're looking for? A Canadian public that's volunteering, a Canadian public that's giving, a Canadian public that's making demands on their political leaders, and a Canadian public that is educated and informed and having smart conversations about complex challenges. So how are we going to develop this overall portfolio and make sure that our organizations are fit for purpose and tooled in order to do all these things? And how are we going to form a coalition for collective action? So we are inviting you on this call to join us. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. We're working with CCIC and the advocacy organizations and others to think through this. And I invite you into that process and to journey with us along this. I think what we've decided as the first sort of steps that we need to undertake as that coalition. So it's not going to be as CanWaCH, and it's not going to be as CCIC, and it's not going to be as PLAN or any individual organization. It's going to be a coalition, a new kind of formation, a working group, not a new organization, not something fancy that needs a whole lot of work, but just a new kind of coalition of the willing. And we're going to agree together on the meta narrative. So I've put out my thoughts on the meta narratives in several spaces. So one meta narrative needs to be on effectiveness and effective use of dollars. There needs to be a meta narrative around how this creates safety and how safe and kind of a safer world is safer for Canadians and all around, and how can we pull on that from different vantage points. We need a narrative on futures. So how does this change the world? How does this create the world we want to live in? So whether it's sustainable future or whether it's a secure future, what is kind of, there's a meta narrative around futures and kind of a hopeful piece. And then what we come up with around polling, and David will speak to this as well, again and again, tapping into the pride of Canadians, who Canadians are, what they believe to be the way that they want to see their values manifest on the world stage. So we need to agree to these meta narratives. We need to think about strategic collective outreach to key publics. We are not going to be Coca-Cola or Frito-Lay that has a massive marketing budget that we can just go out and say, or even the oil and gas sector did this some years ago. We need to get to all Canadians, and we're going to massively move Canadian public opinion on these 3 metrics. We're not ever going to have the kind of resources to do a massive writ large campaign, but we can have a strategic and targeted collective outreach to key publics. So big targeted publics, so demographics, for example, like the people who do donate. How can we move them into that political activation? What is it that we want? What are some of the demands that we want them to make? And we can segment and think about who are those key publics, kind of writ large, that we want. And then there's the riding by riding, the really political, fine-tuned political approach that says, okay, if the finance minister, if Morneau is our blocker to getting what we want his office, we want people knocking on his office door in his riding once a week for the next 7 weeks. And we know we have these Canadians in that riding to do that. So we've never collectively attacked the problem like this. We've individually, and especially the advocacy organizations have, but we haven't collectively really thought together about how to do this. So this is what the Coalition of Willing will be. And then I encourage you to go back to your organizations and think about this piece and think about your risk tolerance around this, and get your CEO, if you're not the CEO on the call, get them excited about their individual capacity to act. And you can do that by saying the fact that we haven't individually acted has been a problem, or you can do that by saying what an opportunity to brand you or your organization as really active in this space. But we need to sweeten the carrot or sharpen the stick. So we need to create some political space where if the government were to step up and give us give the sector, the world, the 1%, that we're calling on, so about $2 billion for a COVID response, that they're going to get broad rippling cheers across key demographics. Sharpening the stick means if they don't step up, if they don't do what they need to do, that there's going to be a fallout from that, that people are going to be upset, that there's going to be an outcry. We're not going to have a mass kind of revolution about this. We don't need that, but we do need them to know that there's a political downside to not acting. And as someone described it in a meeting yesterday, right now is what we have is a sharp carrot. So it is neither a sharp stick, nor is it a sweet carrot. It is a sharp carrot where we're kind of good at saying, yeah, hooray when we do something good, and we're kind of bad at threatening, or we're kind of good at threatening when something that we don't like happens. You know, a few people make some noise about it, and those people are retweeted and supported. But what we don't have, I don't think, the carrot or the stick refined to the way that we need to do, so that we need to have it. So this is what the Coalition of the Willing will be involved in. You're invited along the journey. I hope that I've helped kind of frame out the challenges I see it, and shape what David's comments are kind of coming, how David's comments should come into our space, and the awareness of the baseline that we should have. And get in touch with my team, with myself, if you want to be involved further with this work. So now I will turn it over to David to speak about the, I'm opening my speaking notes so I can get your bio right, David. So I'll open up to David to speak about the polling we did. This polling, very excitingly, and I know it's kind of a small detail, but it builds off of polling that has been done by others, including World Vision and the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, CCIC. Very grateful that they allowed us to reuse their questions so that we could then you know, frame out a little bit of a longer term sense of how things are going. And I think we want to really continue with that. So when we're asking questions, if you're going out to do some polling, please get in touch with us and we can provide you some questions so that when you're asking the question, if it's been asked 3 times before, we can get sort of an arc of opinion on it. David, we've been working with for some time. He's the founding partner and CEO of Abacus Data. So he manages day-to-day operation and leads Abacus. The compliment, this is not in his bio, but someone said to us, we were trying to figure out who to work with, and someone said, well, I really recommend David because he actually thinks about what the polls mean and what it means to your organization. So it was a high compliment for someone who had, from someone who had worked with a lot of different polling firms. So he's an outspoken proponent of transparency in the polling industry. He's regularly called on by CBC, by media organizations to provide expert analysis. He has a doctorate from the University of Calgary and is a professor in several different programs at Carleton University. And he's also a member of the board of directors of the Shaw Center. And I'm not sure why this is in here, but it is interesting because a lot of the conversation comes out about millennials. So David is not shy about his age. He's 35 years old, and so can speak to that millennial demographic that our organizations are thinking a lot about. So thank you, David, so much for your analysis. The report was amazing, and I'm really excited that you're going to get to share some of the findings with folks on the call today. So over to you.
Great. Thanks, Julia, and welcome everybody. I hope everyone's doing well despite everything that's going on. Julia, people often just say my age because if you've never met me, people wonder how old I actually am because I look often younger. And actually, that's an old bio. I'm actually 38, so aging as we go along here. But if we go to the next slide, I'll just jump into it because there's a lot of data and a lot of, I think, conversation to come after, and I want to get into it. But as Julia said, we were engaged to help CanWaCH think about and understand where the public is. And as she said, I've done some work throughout the year, actually. It's been the year of talking about international cooperation and doing research for, as she said, World Vision and CCIC, really trying to get a grips of how does the public all right, sorry about that. How the public is thinking about these issues. So what we did is if we go to the next slide, We did a large national survey, almost 3,000 Canadian adults. We did it in mid-June. This is a very large survey. It's larger than we typically would do. So we had the advantage of oversampling a number of parts of the country and getting good samples across different groups that I'll highlight today. But really for me, the objective of this research and other work that we're doing throughout the sector is trying to close the gap. I think, Julia, your analysis of the political situation and the challenge that the sector has as a whole was spot on. And that is fundamentally, we live in a political world, unfortunately, and not always do policymakers make the right choice that is good for people, that's good for the world, but they're often also thinking about the political, what's right for them politically. And there are issues in which those don't align. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's very difficult. And I think, in my, in prepping and learning about the sector and how public opinion has evolved, whether here in Canada or in other jurisdictions around the world, it's become clear that elite opinion and what the sector thinks have divided themselves, right? And so they don't believe, and I think your comments about from Hamish, I also spoke to him about it in a book chapter I was writing around the election, and he said the exact same thing, that they saw all political upside and no downside to proposing the cuts to ODA spending. And so how do you close that gap? And that's really what we're trying to do in this research. So if we go to the next slide, we started in this survey, and this comes out of some tracking we've done with both World Vision and CCIC, trying to understand what issues Canadians believe are important. What are they concerned about from a global perspective? And not surprising, if we go to the next slide, that the pandemic has brought a lot of focus to the spread of infectious disease. It's the one issue in which a clear majority of Canadians say they're either extremely or very concerned about as a global issue. Now, that's not surprising. I think it's unique. In January, before we did this, it was still high up on the list. Coronavirus was starting to get into the discussions, and we don't have a purely clean version of this of where it would normally be. But I suspect, as you all do, that it spiked as a result of what's going on in the world. Now, the good news on the next slide is when we ask about the health of women and children, 49% of Canadians say they are extremely or very concerned about this on a global basis. And if we go ahead, you'll see, compared to other issues, and we tested a whole bunch of issues, that you're more or less around 4 on the list, right? In terms of the percentage of Canadians who say they are at least very concerned about it. Now, we added it for the tracking for your organization. We're going to continue to track this over time. But relative to some of the other big issues that people are thinking about, health of women and children rates very high, right? And that's a good thing. And that shows the potential appeal and alignment between the work that you're all doing and what Canadians think are priorities. Poverty, climate change, terrorism and extremism, all of those are high up on the list. But as you all know, and I think Canadians don't necessarily understand, is that they're all interconnected. You can't separate out the health of women and children from extremism or poverty or climate change increasingly. And so one of the recommendations that I think that many people talk about is making sure the dots are connected for people. And that's the big theme in my recommendation in terms of how to think about this is, you're all working very hard with your organizations, doing incredibly good work because it's needed. And if you don't do it, no one else will. And that is a very strong motivator. Now, for many Canadians, that is enough for them to support increased ODA spending or to donate to your organizations. But for many others, it's not enough, right? They need to understand what the strategic benefit is of spending some money on aid and not on something else, because they understand we live in a world that there's a zero-sum game when it comes to spending. If we go ahead and look at how views around the health of women and children as an issue compare, you'll see this throughout the presentation. We break it out by gender, by age, by region, and by how people voted in the last election, adding a political lens to all of this. And not surprising, women are more likely to say that's a concern for them than men are. We see a little bit of an age difference. Older Canadians, a little more likely. Regionally, not a big variation. Atlantic Canada and Ontario, a little bit more than elsewhere. But look at that relationship by party. And this is the story. The first part is those parties that are on the left or center left, people who vote for them, are more inclined across the board to believe these are important issues and they're concerned about them. But we also have to remind our conservative friends that, 40% of their own voter base believes the health of women and children is a concerning issue. So to say that all conservatives, and I don't think you all believe this, but to say all conservatives don't believe in foreign, in international cooperation and dealing with these issues is not right. But politically, Hamish knows he doesn't have to worry about his base getting all upset if they run an election on cutting ODA spending. So going ahead to the next slide, the question then is, where do Canadians want to be? And what we did in this survey is we asked, this comes off of work we did with CCIC and Julia, you mentioned this, Canadians overestimate how much we spend. They believe we are doing more than we are actually doing. But that being said, if we go to the next slide, almost all Canadians want Canada to do at least its fair share when it comes to improving women and children's health globally. That's the 90% number. And just over half want Canada to be a leader. And being a leader is that pride, is that alignment with values that Julia spoke to that exists with a large part of, I'm going to say the electorate, but you can also say the public. So if we go ahead to the next slide and we look at how this breaks out, I'll just send your eyes first to where women are, a really important, obviously, political constituency for all parties, but in particular for the Liberals and the New Democrats, those parties on the left. Women are a core part of their coalition. But if you just scan down to the bottom of this slide and you look at how CPC is conservative, LPC is liberal, the breakout by party. And it's not to say, again, that conservatives don't want Canada to do its fair share. In fact, almost all of them, even among conservatives, say that's what they want. It's the difference between being a leader and not being a leader. And there you see Liberals, New Democrats, Green Party supporters really, in some instances, being almost double more likely or twice as likely to want that. So a clear storyline is Canadians, and particularly those for this government that support this government, want Canada to be a leader. And it's sometimes hard communicating the fact that we aren't a leader. And no government wants to admit that. But somehow, weaving that into the conversation, which I think you do effectively in any media you get, needs to continue to happen. Next slide, please. The next piece of this is there's also broad support, as you'd expect, for Canada investing in the health of those living in poor countries. So you're not going to find, at least in survey research, a lot of opposition to this idea. Now, that doesn't mean, and I'm sometimes as much a cynic as the next person, because I look at this data and I say, well, this is all great, but doesn't often translate into how people vote or how people actually demand action. But the base of this is that most Canadians would support the country investing in this. So as a base, that's a solid place to be. If we go to the next slide, we can see again the breakout by demographics, by region, not a lot of variation. And again, not a huge amount across party. So to Julia's point, although some political parties will be more open, it's not a polarizing issue in terms of the idea that we would invest globally to help those living in poor countries around the world. Next slide, please. The next question, though, is this is the risk. And the risk for the sector actually has grown, I think, as a result of the pandemic, even though, as I'll show you in a moment, your ability to tie issues together, I think, has gotten easier because the world appears smaller to Canadians than it ever has. The fiscal impact of the pandemic on government finances, the fact that we have now a $350 billion deficit, and I think there will be increasing debate about what we do to get back into a more reasonable fiscal position, not necessarily a balanced budget, but something that resembles where we were before, means that there's risk. And let me show you how. First, next slide, that question about reducing foreign aid spending. So we asked Canadians, if, you know, in the last election, a political party promised to reduce ODA spending by a quarter and focus only on really disaster and humanitarian relief. 49% of Canadians think that is a good idea. If we go to the next slide. And that's the other side of it. So how can they, on one hand, say 63% support investing in you know, people living in poor parts of the world, but on the other hand, support reducing ODA spending? And that's the challenge. And you can see, while conservatives are much more likely to support this action, there's also broad support among Liberal and NDP supporters, which you would not think is there. So this is that risk that, you know, Minister Gould is trying to overcome, probably around the cabinet table with the Minister of Finance, with the PMO, who don't see much political upside in following through with what they know is right and what you have been arguing is the right thing to do, because they see risk there. And they see risk, particularly in a world where our inclination now as people generally is to look inward, is to focus on recovery of our own country and not feel that, you know, a Canada first kind of approach is much more natural today. It's always been that way, but in the current context, even more so. We go to the next slide. And this is data that didn't come from our survey, but I did it and I wanted to share because I think it shows the real risk. We did this survey last week, and it came after the Minister of Finance's announcement, his fiscal snapshot that he did in Ottawa, I guess 2 weeks now. And what it shows is, we asked people, if government was forced to make some spending reductions to get the budget back into a better place, do you think the following cuts or changes to policy are a good idea or a bad idea? And I just point you to the second line there, reducing the amount Canada spends on foreign aid, right? That is, to me, a very scary place, right? If you're also a federal government employee, you can see there's very broad support for cutting the public service. So Canadians are instinctively going to side with arguments that doesn't appear to hurt them. So look what's at the bottom of the list: reducing transfers to provinces for health and education, raising the retirement age, reducing the amount government spends on law enforcement, even reducing spending on military is much more opposed than cutting foreign aid. And so this is the risk, is that in any debate about fiscal restraint, I don't think this government's going to move to austerity, but I think the Conservatives are going to ask questions around how do we get there, and that's what you have to fight against. You're not going to overnight turn that 66% into 19, but you have to start asking yourselves, why is it that Canadians are defensive about transfers to health and education, but willing to forego not just increases to foreign aid or ODA spending, but actually supporting reducing the budget already? That's the question. And I know, Julia, you're thinking about that, and that's a big part of your strategy. Going ahead, please. So then the question is, how do you frame this? How do you engage the public in a conversation? How do you engage the media? How do you expand the audience outside of your sector and get others? And one of the recommendations that I make to you all is also to think about who else outside of your sector can become allies. Is there any allies in the business community? Are there allies in academia, allies in other sectors that are willing to say, yes, we need to engage globally, or else some of these problems that we don't want to come back here are going to be affected. So we did some research around framing. If we go ahead. The first part is the upside, if there is any upside of a global pandemic, is Canadians are much more aware of how small our world actually is. That what happens in other parts of the world doesn't stay in other parts of the world. And we can't really win the fight against COVID unless we do it at a global basis. And that's clear in the research we did with World Vision, which they released a few weeks ago, and in our updated survey for you that shows the same thing. If we go ahead, you basically have a clear majority agreeing, 73%, that before a vaccine is found, unless COVID-19 is controlled in all parts of the world, we really won't be able to return to normal here in Canada, right? That is a broad recognition. We only have to look at what's going on in the United States and its impact on public opinion here around reopening the economy to understand that we don't live in a bubble here. And if anything, we are heavily influenced by media, certainly from the United States, but we've got a little more global perspective than Americans, but I would say less a global perspective typically than Europeans normally would. But this has expanded our horizons. If we go to the next slide, we also tested a number of arguments. And this is how we try to anticipate as best we can through survey research what works and what won't at pulling people towards your side of the argument as opposed to pushing them away. And we tested a frame around health systems and improving health systems in poorer countries as a way to prevent an outbreak and potentially slowing the economic recovery globally, but also in Canada. And we find that 37% say it is a very good reason for us to engage more globally, for us to increase our contributions to ODA spending. That's one of the highest numbers we saw in some of the framing we tested. Most people say it's a good reason, but I always look at that the group that says it's a very good reason, the most or extreme support for it. So that frame works, right? Connecting the dots between what happens here in Canada and other parts of the world. You can't isolate the two and you have to connect them. So that's the first point. If you go to the next slide, we also, the strategic imperative of doing more is a very powerful motivator for a lot of people, but so too is the moral argument, right? We simply have a responsibility as a rich, wealthy nation to help those in less fortunate and more vulnerable positions do more. So if we go to the next slide, and we tested an argument that Canada has a responsibility as a G7 nation to reduce suffering and inequality for the most vulnerable, you can see 27%, 10 points lower, but still good enough, but not as good as the previous framing at driving people towards thinking this is a good reason to do it. Now, that gap of 10 points is important because it shows that if you only talk about responsibility, if you only talk about moral, it's the moral thing to do, it's the right thing to do, it doesn't compel people enough to say that is the reason to do it. You have to speak to different audiences with slightly different arguments to get a larger group engaged. On the next slide, we asked also trying to frame whether we could tie our own economic recovery to the health of people around the world. And we did that in a number of ways. If we go to the next slide, we asked a question that asked, will investing in the health systems of poorer countries help Canada's economic recovery? And, there's two ways of looking at basically a split decision here. One way is it's not a very good argument because only about half of people side with it. I think actually, when you look at the fact that half are willing to say, actually, no, I think it might help, that's really reassuring. Because I actually expected this number to be lower that said help, not help. And so this is the foundation. This is the start of this argument that, again, we're interconnected. The health systems of poorer countries can help us grow here. We can't trade with countries that close their borders. We can't engage globally if we don't open everything up again. And that requires everybody to overcome this health crisis and any future health crisis that will certainly come along again. If we go to the next slide, if we look at this across these subgroups, again, you'll see the typical patterns. Younger Canadians, in fact, much more receptive to this idea that if we help other countries' health systems, that it will help our recovery. Quebecers, much more than other parts of the country. And if you look at the political divides, it's the same pattern. So conservatives, much more likely to say that's not going to help versus what Liberals and New Democrats and Green Party voters have said. So that is worth thinking about in terms of this frame being really effective with young people in particular. Next slide, please. So to wrap up then, and I know we're getting close to one, and I want to leave time for some questions. Based on our research here and other work we've done with World Vision and CCIC and looking at the broader experience that I have trying to understand the public, which is not always easy and it's often contradictory, it appears to me that the framing that will likely work going forward is one that first highlights the impact of the work that you're already doing. What's Canada doing? Show me tangible effects. In the work we did with CCIC, a lot of Canadians actually felt that spending on ODA didn't really, in their minds, solve problems, right? So you need to continue to not assume that people understand what you're doing, and the importance that both funding and, you know, volunteers and all of you in your organizations are doing every single day. That you kind of continue to raise that you have to point to the people themselves and the specific problems. Generalities and getting lost in percentages of GDP or GNI spending on ODA is so technical and not meaningful to people that it falls on deaf ears, right? And so that's important. But I think you have to also highlight the interconnectedness of our world and the direct financial and health benefits for Canadians from these types of investments. That it's sometimes uncomfortable, I know, for folks in the sector to think about the strategic, self-interested arguments, but I strongly believe they're important to be made, that you have to link both the responsibility argument with the self-interested argument if you're going to grow the tent and fight back against arguments that cutting ODA and cutting foreign and international cooperation is something we can afford to do. We actually can't afford to do. It needs to be the argument because it creates greater problems, not just for the people living in these conditions, but for us here at home as well. So I will end there just with 3 points in terms of recommendations. The first is, as I already alluded to, I think, you know, and this is not a criticism of your sector, but as an outsider, I guess I can be a little bit of an outsider, is that I've come to meet many of you and talk to those in the organizations. My neighbor, I learned recently, works for an international cooperation organization as well. And you're a very tight-knit small community, but you have to also get outside of that and connect with folks and build coalitions and partnerships with organizations you may not actually think have alignment, but can come to see the world through your eyes because you are seeing it through eyes that, again, we never really get to see. So expanding that coalition. Number 2 is, I think, again, you have to speak to where people are. You're competing with a lot of information. You're competing with misinformation now as well. And these perceptions about how much we spend and what that money is used for, and the easy fallback to say, oh, all that money gets spent on administration, it doesn't do any good, is so easy to throw up as reasons not to support your organizations, but they're not real ones, and you need to fight back against them aggressively. And so that's my final point, is as much as I think you are all very humble and reflective of the work that you do, don't be afraid to be aggressive. Don't be afraid to demand what you think is right. And I love, Julia, what you're saying about mobilizing people and knocking on doors. The thing that motivates MPs more than anything is getting phone calls and visits to their offices, because they often like Canadians, overestimate what that means, right? If those are the only contact points they have, they will believe that that's the view of their constituents, and you need to encourage that. So I'll stop there, and the next slide just has my contact info. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, you can also do it through Julia or Charmaine. But I'm happy to take questions for as long as you're willing to stay on. So thank you very much.
So I think I've had a note from Charmaine that we actually do have to close off at 2, unfortunately, but that's because I talked for too long. So the best way, I think, to continue the conversation, if there's appetite, we can have another conversation, but I would love us to collect some of the questions. I just got one from Brittany here. We noticed the poll didn't include the territories. Was there a reason for this? So I think we could probably collect, a handful of questions, and then David and I could put together, and Charmaine could put together a response and send it out or post it beside the link to this that we have that we'll put up on the website. Hoping that's satisfactory, and because I can't see you, I can't see you nodding your heads that no, that's not satisfactory. So my apologies for going a little bit over time. Really appreciate, David, your insights and your thoughts. I have a feeling that contact info will be well used, and I would highly encourage people to get in touch with David, because I think it's this kind of strategic thinking that we have to move beyond the, oh my goodness, this is bad news or good news or however you're receiving it, and to the how do we move forward. And I think there's some really important insights in his presentation around that, around the framing and what does work, and seeing those numbers of half of Canadians, this is important, and utilizing that and starting from that as our starting line and seeing where we can go. So I invite you to come along in this journey with us. I invite you to join our groups, to send in questions to Charmaine and to our team. We've got another webinar next Wednesday, very different subject matter, but please do come or pass along to programming folks within your organizations. I think it will be as interesting as all of our webinars are, which we've got a lot of feedback that people are enjoying them. So thanks so much, everyone, and we look forward to connecting with you after the webinar.